Hey guys, welcome to another podcast style video. This video is going to be about something that a lot of people ask me questions about, and it's the Wisefab grip modification for the E90 chassis. And that also applies, of course, to the 1 Series and a lot of the other cars that are very similar. Um, One thing that's really important is that people understand the scope of things. So, and by the scope, I mean the bigger picture and the different things that we're dealing with, because there seems to be kind of a misunderstanding about this grip kit. So people are basically thinking like, oh, if you install this kit, it's just going to linearly make more grip and it's going to be better, faster to drift and easier to chase people and all kinds of things. So if you look at um, the rear suspension of the BMW E90, which is a multi-link system, unlike the BMW E36, E46, which is a trailing arm. Um, you're going to be noticing that it's a very, very complicated rear suspension. It's actually way more difficult than people think. It's actually way more elaborate and advanced than the S chassis rear suspension, although that's also a multi-link, but the S chassis is like a lot simpler in operation compared to how advanced the E90 rear axle is. All these types of axles originate from the Mercedes 190 rear axle, which in German is called Raumlenker, which is the design that Mercedes made for the Mercedes 190, which is like, I think it's introduced in 83 or something. Every other design is leaning on that's similar to that. So most of the manufacturers will have a similar type of design, so the same amount of control arms and all these kinds of things, and it's basically all drawing back to that Mercedes design. Although there's a couple really key differences in the E90 design, and basically what the rear suspension setup does is change the geometry of the wheel under suspension. And with the Wisefab kits, we try to stay on neutral. So if the car suspends, like if you have an S chassis and you would remove the shock absorbers and you would droop the wheel out all the way to the lowest point and droop it all the way up to the highest, or push it all the way up in the chassis to the highest point with the standard Nissan rear suspension, you're going to be freaked out. Like it's going to look really, really bad. And there's going to be a lot of changes in the geometry of the wheels, which is what we really don't want. So with the Wisefab kit, for instance, Nissan and all that stuff, we aim to get no change in the wheels. So we want the wheels to stay basically in the same setting as they are static, so on the static alignment. So for instance, the static toe is going to be 0. We want to have the dynamic toe, so the toe when the car basically moves the suspension, we want the dynamic toe to stay the same. Although at one point you're going to reach a level of drifting where people don't want that. So people want to have dynamic toe gain, as it's called, which means that as you compress the suspension, the wheels are going to be towing in more than they are already towed in on the static setting. That's like advanced driving, of course, because if you're going to be lifting off the throttle and the rear is going to come up, then you're obviously still changing that geometry back again to 0 or to whatever. So it's definitely not something that's super easy to drive. And one of the big misunderstandings is exactly that. So the big misunderstanding is that you can get a car that drives really nice, that basically drives like a missile car or like a Pro M kind of deal or a bolt-on car, but then just with more power and more grip. That's almost impossible. If you start to go to FD levels of grip, the car basically is way less enjoyable to drive. And people just think like, oh, I'll go from 400 horsepower to 700 horsepower to 900 horsepower, and I'll just up the grip in the same increments, and it's basically going to be the same car, but then with more power and more grip. It's not. That's like a total illusion. So the FD cars, they're not super easy to drive. And like I said before in interviews and in podcasts, there's this really nice picture which says, if you can drift with 100 horsepower, 1,000 horsepower won't help you. As said before, I agree with that. But just because you can drift with 100 horsepower doesn't mean you can drift with 1,000 horsepower. So that really, I'm sorry to say that, and people may say like, oh, asshole, whatever. It's just not true. So these cars are very, very, very difficult to drive. If you grip up a car like an E90 or an S chassis or an E46 to the maximum level that you can grip them up these days with things like the Feal suspension, shock absorbers, the tires that we can get like the Velino tires or the Westlakes we had in Europe. And there's lots of these cheater tires which are super soft compound, like way softer compound than advertised. That really makes those cars so people have no frame of reference on how fast these cars are. Like an FD car with 1,000 horsepower, the grip level is also advanced so far that it's almost like the power to grip ratio of a missile car. So if you have like a standard run-of-the-mill SR20 S14 with like some coilovers and some mods, um, versus a really well set up Formula Drift S chassis, it's almost going to be the same in power versus grip level. It's not like you're like, oh, you just flex your ankle a little bit, 1,000 horsepower, lights up the rear tires, and then you're gone, and every solution can be solved with big power. It's just not true. Those cars are so gripped up that like the ratio is, you're going back to the ratio again of a low powered car, although the driving characteristics are completely different. If you look at the interview I did with Odie, and I speak a lot with other drivers, FD drivers, DMAC drivers, a lot of guys that we sell parts to, or that we have our conversations with. So when FD Pro Spec is happening, there's a couple guys that I help, and we talk to them like when they're testing the car, when they're qualifying, whatever. We have like our direct chat. And lots of the pro spec guys don't have suspension people on board. It's basically just a team with a lot of friends, and sometimes they just really don't know what to do, and they're like, oh, the car is not gripped up or too gripped up or whatever. So I try to help them. They send me messages when they're working on the car. I'm saying, hey, try this, try that. Very difficult, of course, when you're not there in person, but like some guys like Rudy Hansen is really happy with some of the feedback that we give him. So that's a little bit of the background of like the whole grip thing. Pro drift cars are really, really gripped up in 2022. As said, like they are definitely not easy to drive. Some of them are not really enjoyable to drive. If you look at some of the settings in the rear axle of some FD cars, it's like a very, very difficult car to drive on the limit. Especially guys that have been doing it for ages. They really developed the car to suit like their driving style. Most other drivers probably wouldn't even be able to drift with a car that's not set up to their liking. And like that's the really big misconception, that it's like it will drive the same as my Drift Week M3, which is a very smooth. If you see the video, you can see the car is very smooth. It's very easy to control. It has a lot of self-steer, and it's basically like as much feedback and grip as you want from a car. But it's only 340 horsepower, of course. So what everybody wants is that exact same car extrapolated with power and grip. So they just want, like, for instance, my Drift Week car with the same characteristics and as easy as that is to drive, but then with 1,000 horsepower and 2.5 times the grip. I've got news for everybody. That's, you can't do that. So the car is always, you're always going to be fighting the car, and it's not going to be very enjoyable to drive unless you're on like 80 or 90%. So if you have an FD car and you dial it down to 80 or 90%, it becomes a super nice car to drive, of course. But if it's as gripped up as those guys send it into competition, it's definitely not an enjoyable car to drive. Like, it's not like, oh man, let's go for a drive, let's go for a drift, let's do some laps. No, you're really fighting that car. And if you're not, then you're probably not hanging with the big boys and not being fast enough for the big boys. Even a Corvette, which is a very, very easy car to drive, it's an extremely logical chassis. It's a very low center of gravity. Has a lot of mechanical grip, so even if you run like cheap shocks or even road car shocks on a drift Corvette, it's going to be faster than most other cars. So I drove Richard's car at a couple tracks And we had guys who were pretty gripped up with semi-slick tires on, for instance, Z or an S chassis, and we were on very hard road car shocks on that car with a road car tire, and we could hang with them. And if you look at the footage that I've done at Apple Valley, you can see that we're actually pulling away from drivers that are way more gripped up with a way better tire than us. So that chassis has a huge amount of mechanical grip. So you can grip that car up like pretty well before it becomes undrivable. But for instance, an E90 with the Wisefab grip mod, which is this video is basically about, that's not going to be a nice car to drive. And there's guys that contact me saying, hey Wout, can you hook me up with E90 rear suspension, Wisefab, and I want to have the grip kit. I'm like, yeah, I get that, but why? Yeah, because this year is really my year and I really want to win, and we've got a really great motor coming up, and this time, this is the year, I can feel it. This is the year we're going to beat James Dean. Okay, cool. But the grip kit, like, we should actually rename that and call it like the 1000 horsepower plus Formula Drift kit or something, because if you're on 500-600 horsepower, it really doesn't make much sense to run that kit, to be honest. Not to try to insult people or whatever, but if you have a 500-600 horsepower E90, you can totally get by with the grip you can get from the shocks and from the rear tires. And when you're completely played out with that, which is almost impossible with 500-600 horsepower, so if you put Feal 442s two ways on the car, you set it up correctly, and you have the standard Wisefab E90 rear suspension, and you run a sticky tire, you're gonna run out of power to spin the tires. If you grip that up completely, 600 horsepower is not enough. So you're going to be entering the realm of really high horsepower if you want that kit. So you're going to be running at least 800 horsepower and a lot of torque. So it's going to be either a turbo motor with a nitrous shot or a very gnarly V8 with a supercharger or something like that. You really need to be on those FD levels of power, because it gives a car not only a lot of side bite, but it also gives it a huge amount of forward bite. And to give you an example, if you run low horsepower, and with low horsepower for FD levels, it would be like 500-600 horsepower, the car is gonna, instead of drifting, it's gonna travel a lot forward, because it's forward bite that you're adding with the Wisefab grip kit. And it has 3 settings. So the grip kit basically is a piece that you weld on the subframe, and a different length arm. So the traction rod, the number 7 arm, is going to be changed, like the pickup point of it is going to be changed. What that does under load is change the geometry of the rear wheel. So instead of it staying on 0, it's going to be changing. And what's happening is that you're adding side bite, but you're mostly adding a lot of forward bite. And if you're entering a corner, let's say you're in Riga at Drift Masters, and it's like a really fast entry, really fast shallow entry, and your car is not powerful enough to overcome that forward bite and make it rotate into the corner, then you're just going to understeer and go into the wall. And that's just lack of power. You're just not lighting up the tires anymore because you're so gripped up. And like I said before, you need to be on the edge with the shocks, so your shocks need to be super gripped up. And your tires, you need to run sticky tires. You can get the Feal tires that Piotr drove with in DMAC. Like, everybody's seen Piotr in Riga. It's just a rocket ship. Like, the car, it's just crazy. And part of that is, of course, the Feal tires. So if you run an E90 and you're like, hey, I really want to win, and I want to have as much grip as possible in the car, the best thing to do is to get a really good set of two-way shocks and have them set up correctly. Like somebody like Odie is, of course, a wealth of knowledge. That's why we sell the Feal stuff, because like you just get Odie's knowledge for free, and it's a very specifically drift-made shock. So you can grip the car up like crazy with those things. When I put the Feal suspension on my car for the first time, I wanted to keep it secret, because I was like, this is such a cheater mod on the car. Like, you add so much grip to the car that it's, you know, I almost didn't want to start selling it. I just wanted to keep it for myself. The set I have on my M3 Drift Week car, if we completely grip that up, so if I completely loosen up the rear shocks, that car is not going to drift. Not even with 50 or 60 psi in the tires, it's just not going to drift. So that's how much grip you can get from shocks, and how much difference that makes. And then there's of course the tires. So let's say if you're like, hey, I've got 700 horsepower LS3 motor, and I really want to win in any competition. So it could be Europe or whatever, or Pro Spec or whatever. Then you can, like with Pro Spec, you obviously need to run the GT radial tire, but you could run a really good two-way or three-way suspension on that car, and you should really get by with that. So that should really be your weapon to add the grip. If you are like completely played out with that, and you're saying like, hey man, I'm leaving the pit lane with 15 psi in the tires and the shocks are on full soft, and I still need more grip, and your car can handle that, and you can handle that as a driver, um, then you should consider the Wisefab grip kit. But not sooner than that, because the car is going to be less enjoyable to drive, because there's so much geometry changing going on that it's way more like walking a tightrope. Um, and like I said, you definitely need to have all that power to overcome that extra forward bite that you're going to get from that kit. So I don't want to get too much into the whole details of the rear suspension, because it's like almost impossible to do that in like a podcast style video. I'd need to have like a subframe and a suspension. We have all that stuff at the shop, so I could like set that up and kind of like cycle it through um, the motions that it would do when you're driving the car, and show you guys what's happening over there. You can do it on your own car. Like if this video applies to you, if you're building an E90 or 1 Series or any other car, because basically the Supra GR, the Mark V Supra, the 2 Series, the E90, all these cars, it's basically the same layout for the rear axle. It's just different length arms and a little bit different pickup points, but there's not a huge difference in any of those cars. It's all basically E90, which is basically Mercedes rear axle. So I don't want to dive too deep into that, because it would become way too technical and we would lose people along the way. But if you just look at it as your rear axle like a unit that you just want to use like a transmission or a rear end, if you add the grip kit, it's just gonna get way more forward bite, a little bit more side bite, but the side bite on the E90 is already pretty good. Um, and and like I said, it's not going to make the car very enjoyable to drive, and it's going to put a huge amount of stress on all the components in the car, even on the subframe pickup points, everything. The subframe itself is going to be under huge stress, because there's extreme forces going on. So you can imagine that that car has sticky tires and soft shocks, and the car is like 1,500 kilos or 3,100 pounds, and you're pushing 800 or 900 horsepower through it, and your suspension is actually going to work against that to push that car into a different path. So those forces are insane. Like people have no clue. You're talking about tens of thousands of kilos of stress. It's basically like taking a 2.5 ton truck and hanging it on your subframe. That's what's going on. That's the forces that are at play with those gripped up cars and that kind of power level. So my message to everyone who's saying like, hey, well, get me the grip kit, I really need the grip kit, you need to be really advanced. You need to be top 10 drift masters or FD material. Like I'm just gonna lay it down. I'm just gonna be straightforward about it. You need to be a really really good driver, and you need to really have the car, and just not only the motor but also the transmission and the rear end and the axles and all that stuff to make that work. And that's like there's a very small amount of people that actually applies to, because 99.9% of the people who ask me for the grip kit, they haven't played out the game, they haven't finished the game of the shock and the tire grip, which is where you should start with. Just get the geometry nice and smooth. So make sure that your geometry, you can have a little toe in, of course, you can do whatever you want. But make sure that the geometry is nice and predictable in the rear axle, so you don't have a lot of toe gain. Obviously, you don't want to have any camber gain, all those kinds of things. There's so much. Like I could make 10 videos about the rear axle of an E90 alone. If you have very specific questions, you can always send us an email about it, of course. But you want to set that rear axle up so the car is enjoyable to drive. So it's smooth, it's nice, it's predictable. It doesn't have a lot of change going on when the suspension is either compressing or drooping. And you want to grip up the car with the shocks and the tires first. That's what you want to do. And once you're done with that, that's where you add the grip kit. And the grip kit has different settings. There's actually a driver that put the grip kit on a car, and the car wouldn't do donuts anymore in the burnout box because it was just spiraling out. because of the forward bite adding. So I'm always saying, when I speak with Wisefab, I always say like, hey, we should rename that kit. We shouldn't call it a grip kit, because people think that there's like some kind of problem with the E90 rear axle that you need to solve with that grip kit. But like I said in the beginning, is really the scope. So the whole picture of that it's a pretty good car. I would say that the E46, E36 is still a little bit better rear axle, but E90 style rear axle, so E90 Supra, F22, F80, whatever, that's a really good rear axle. Um, and the grip kit is just like the absolute last step that you're going to put in there when you're really super gripped up with everything else, and you're running like power adders on top of a V8 and all that kind of stuff. So keep that in mind. Um, and yeah, keep in mind that it's the rear suspension of those cars is kind of complicated, and you really need to know what you're doing. And for instance, like the traction arms, which the S chassis of course has, which changes the dynamic toe, which is the same, bottom line, the same kind of system as is present on the E90. Like that's something that you really should be playing around with only when you really know the car, if everything's set up correctly. Because like I said, like if you put a huge amount of toe gain in the car, it's just a less nice car to drive. And the final words is, of course, if you get the car super gripped up to win competitions like FD and DMAC, don't expect it to be a very enjoyable car to drive. It's just going to be, if you really go looking for that last 5% of suspension performance, it needs to be like a knife edge. It needs to be a car where you can just step it up like with little steps. Like you need to be on the edge immediately. You need to be perfect with all your inputs. You need to be perfect with your whole setup, with everything. And then it's going to be at peak performance, which you need to be really honest with yourself if you are that kind of driver. I think there's only a handful drivers in Europe, um, and probably 15 to 20 in America, that I would say like that they can really completely play out that chassis and get the most performance out of that chassis. So don't feel bad if it's not you. Um, and I hope this sheds a little bit of light on the Wisefab grip modification for the E90. Let me know below if you guys want to hear other things or what would be interesting to you guys. And I hope you have a fantastic day.
Don't forget to take a look at our website as well, einzel.nl. We ship worldwide, of course, Wisefab, Feal suspension, our own brand Einzel, gearboxes, quick change differentials, axles, all kinds of things. A lot of fabrication components, of course, air jacks, subframes for quick change, you name it. Drop us an email and we'll hook you up.